On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 in the morning, a reactor exploded in Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. After that, the entire surrounding area turned into a radioactive death zone, and it remains one to this day. And it is in this very death zone that response teams have made some absolutely shocking and disturbing discoveries over the years. The first creepy find was made in the waters around the nuclear power plant. There, crews kept spotting giant creatures lurking beneath the surface. Some people were convinced they were mutated water monsters created by the radiation, and nobody knew how dangerous these animals might be. In reality, they turned out to be catfish, but they were so enormous that they could easily rival a human in size. Nobody had ever seen catfish this gigantic before. Many believe their incredible size was a result of the radioactivity. Researchers, though, came up with a different explanation. Because the area had been deserted by humans for decades and nobody was catching the animals, the catfish were able to grow undisturbed and live to an unusually old age. The next disturbing find came from the actual site of the explosion. A few months after the disaster, the workers on site decided it was time to inspect the damage underneath the reactor. Of course, this was still extremely dangerous, so it could only be done with proper protective equipment. The response team was also equipped with a dosimeter, a device that measures radiation dose. As they descended into the basement levels, the dosimeter strangely began registering higher and higher radiation levels, even though they were actually moving farther and farther away from the reactor above them. So, they knew there had to be a powerful source of radiation somewhere beneath the building. Just before room 217, the dosimeter suddenly spiked violently and broke. Whatever was inside that room was so radioactive that they did not even have the tools to measure it. The team immediately decided to turn back and avoid exposing themselves to any further danger. After that, attempts were made to send special robots down there, but they all broke down because of the intense radiation. So, they had to send a human being down once again to examine the room more closely. Radiation protection specialist Arthur Korneyev volunteered. Many people considered it a suicide mission because the radiation levels there were 10,000 times higher than during an X-ray. He did it anyway, and then he made the incredible discovery. Inside the room was a huge pitch-black mass of hardened lava-like material. Its wrinkled surface and shape resembled an elephant's foot. That is why, to this day, it is known as the elephant's foot. But how did this highly radioactive mixture get there? Researchers found out that it was the core of the reactor. It had not simply exploded, it had literally melted. The molten lava-like mass then ate through the reactor floor like acid and seeped into the lower levels of the building. Just a few kilometers west of the nuclear power plant, workers came across another terrifying sight. Soldiers who arrived at the site a few days after the disaster discovered that a nearby pine forest had suddenly turned from green to blood red. It was as if autumn had arrived overnight. Everyone wondered how that could have happened. The explanation is fairly simple. The radioactive cloud that rained down on the surrounding area destroyed the chlorophyll in the needles, and it happened in an extremely short amount of time. What remained was a dead forest that, from then on, was contaminated with intense radiation. It is said that this was actually the most dangerous radioactive place in the entire Chernobyl exclusion zone. Strangely, 15 years after the disaster, the trees still had not rotted, even though they had been dead for a long time. Normally, trees would have decomposed long ago after that much time. So researchers carried out several tests and eventually realized that not only the plants, but also the insects and bacteria had been damaged by the radiation. There was simply a lack of natural decomposers. For the mammals, however, the nuclear disaster actually had one major advantage. After all the residents moved away from the contaminated area, the animals in Chernobyl could finally spread out and reproduce undisturbed. Wolves, moose, and wild boar settled there. So, of all places, one of the most dangerous locations in the world developed into a huge nature reserve. That said, the radiation did not leave the animals completely untouched. In 2023, volunteers in the exclusion zone came across a pack of feral dogs with a very strange coat color. They were quite literally blue. Scientists suspect that the long-term radiation exposure may have something to do with this change in their fur. Even more astonishing, though, is that the animals otherwise appeared healthy. They gave birth to healthy puppies and showed hardly any obvious damage from the radiation. It is believed that they may have developed some kind of resistance to the radiation, which could even make them less susceptible to cancer. Now let's move on to a find that looks truly creepy at first glance and feels like something straight out of an apocalypse. It was discovered in this school in Pripyat. Before the disaster, hundreds of children attended it every day. Today it's a ghostly abandoned building. But one thing still reminds us of the children who once studied there. Countless gas masks were found in the former cafeteria. The entire floor was covered with them. However, the story behind them is different from what you might assume. The masks were not worn by the children during the evacuation. They had been intended for emergencies, but they were not used after the disaster. The government believed that unnecessary panic would spread if residents were told to wear gas masks. So, the masks remained stored away in the school's cupboards. It is suspected, however, that a few years later, criminals broke into the school building, took all the gas masks apart, and stole the silver inside them. That is why the masks were left scattered all over the floor. Scientists made the next discovery directly inside the reactor building. As they walked through the corridors, they noticed strange black spots on the walls. These were clearly a type of fungus. The researchers wondered how it could survive in such an extremely radioactive environment, let alone spread. For most other living beings and plants, the radiation would be deadly, but the fungus seemed completely unaffected by it. After it was examined in the lab, it turned out that a new species had developed, one that apparently possessed an ability nobody had thought possible. This so-called radiotrophic fungus used the radiation for its own growth and as a source of energy. One reason for this is that the fungus contains large amounts of melanin, which protects its cells from damage. The next thing discovered was an entire facility that almost nobody knew even existed. It had been kept strictly secret for years. It was only because of the Chernobyl disaster that the outside world eventually learned about it. It is the so-called Duga facility, a radar system more than 150 meters tall, standing in the middle of the forest. Its purpose was to detect missile launches from the United States at an early stage. The radar could not only see as far as the horizon, it also used the Earth's ionosphere to reflect radio signals over thousands of kilometers. The area around the facility was a restricted military zone and was heavily guarded. Its exact location, its size, and many details were known to almost nobody. After the disaster, the facility was abandoned, and that is how it was eventually found. Since then, it has been regularly visited by researchers, journalists, and tourists. Would you like to see all these disturbing discoveries with your own eyes one day? Let us know in the comments.